Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to go over some elements of the Arthurian legend. And kind of like the questions that we had with Beowulf, one of the first things people always want to know is, was there actually a real King Arthur? And this has been a debate that goes way back, particularly when some of the kings of England wanted to kind of boost up their lineage and say that they were related to this famous king from mythology. So they were trying to justify that connection as a way to prove that they were the rightful current kings and queens. And that modern scholarship has pretty much determined that there probably was an actual person someplace in the middle of this legend. But a little bit like we know Santa Claus, that there was a St. Nicholas, a lot of the things that have grown up and the stories that have grown up around them may or may not actually be connected to history, but have entered into this mythology that we now have. So from the research that we have, we know some things about a real King Arthur. We know that he would have gained fame fighting off the Germanic invaders from the late 5th and 6th centuries, and that he, even if there wasn't an actual king, we really can't deny that there's been this huge influence of this legend. There's literature, art, music, and even our culture that have so many references to this ideal of the King Arthur. And even though there's been a lot of historical novels that have kind of put him into a 6th century setting, it's really this ideal figure from the late Middle Ages that we have that people most think of when they think about a King Arthur. So as we trace this back, we find this scholar named Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was about from the 12th century, so around the 1100s, included someone named Arthur in this history book that he put together, Historia Regnum Britanniae, which is the history of the kings of Britain, and he listed a King Arthur. Now, whether or not this is something he invented or actual traditional history, we don't know, but we know that he was accurately recording all of the other kings and queens or trying to do this scholarship and this research on it. So he listed a King Arthur who was the son of someone named Uther and had defeated the barbarians, who again were probably the Vikings, these Germanic tribes coming over, in dozens of battles, and that he conquered this wide empire and eventually even went to war with the Romans, who were invading England and also taking over this time. The story goes that when King Arthur went back home after fighting all these battles, his nephew, whose name was Mordred, had actually taken over from him while Arthur was gone. Mordred had taken Guinevere the queen and was ruling in his stead, and that they had this big battle between the uncle and the nephew at the end. And then the saga obviously is built up over hundreds of years, and these Celtic traditions of Arthur came over to the continent through Brittany, and then the Norman invasion kind of included Arthur and folded him into this mythology. So ignoring the idea of a King Arthur, if we look at the Celtic stories, and remember these were the pagan tribes that lived on the mainland of Britain before the German invaders, Arthur was kind of this mythic figure for them, and there were these ballads that spoke of this man named Arthur. Again, said to be the son of Uther Pendragon and someone named Igraine, who was from Cornwall. Again, these are all cities in Britain. And he became associated with magic and legend, as well as these Christian virtues and morality. And there are Roman stories that have come to us from the Latin chronicling a King Arthur as a military leader known as the Dux Bellorum, which would be this war hero, this war leader. And that in this case is kind of like Beowulf, his strength and his skill in battle is stressed, not so much this idea of him being a figure of Christian virtue. And he's said to have led a band of warriors that defeated the Saxon invaders. Again, these are these tribes coming over. And that he was actually the son of a Roman nobleman who married one of the local Angel women. So this would have been a Roman soldier who met this woman who was part of these pagan tribes and got married. And then their son, Arthur, ended up helping to defeat the Saxons who were coming in. When we finally get the romance stories written down, and remember, we're not talking about romance here as in dating and love and marriage, but that style of literature. The romances stress not so much Arthur's skill in battle, although he was, again, said to be a great leader, but this ideals of chivalry, and this is the first time that we get this love triangle in with the introduction of Lancelot. who fell in love with Arthur's queen but was too noble to do anything about it. The romances also added in some of the enchanted elements, and we'd seen a little bit of this with the pagan traditions, but bringing in the idea of this fancy sword Excalibur, Merlin, the wizard who guided him, and the Lady of the Lake who was the keeper of the sword. And the romances are also the ones that stress this idea of the once and future king, that Arthur is going to eventually return back to the land that he loved and rule Britain in her time of need, that there will be another coming of this king. So in several of versions that come out of the Romantic tradition, Arthur's death is implied but not necessarily shown. We know that he's wounded and probably mortally wounded, but he's carried off by the women of the lake, or just by the Lady of the Lake, to this barge to the Vale of Avalon, and where supposedly they tended to him, and again maybe where he's resting and will return to save Britain at some point. But we also know that the historical Arthur, there was a King Arthur. There was a grave that was discovered at Glastonbury during the reign of Henry II. So in the time period that we're studying here in the Middle Ages, that was supposedly to be the grave site of the actual King Arthur of England. So just like we don't really know if there's an historical Santa Claus, but there's some elements of the story that stay the same: the red suit, driving the sleigh, bringing toys to children. When you look at the Arthurian legends, there are some elements that play out across all these different tellings, whether they're coming out of the French tradition, out of the Celtic tradition, or out of the Roman tradition, or even out of things that were invented much later on. So we're going to take a look at some of these common threads, these motifs that run through most of the Arthurian legends. So the first are the knights. These were always handpicked by Arthur. They were bound by this code of chivalry, and many of them actually had their own stories and became famous for their own deeds. Now, the character of Lancelot shows up in the romances. Lancelot is supposed to be the ideal knight. He's pretty much perfect in every way, but he has this star-crossed thing where after Guinevere is married to Arthur, and they have a perfectly happy marriage, when Lancelot and Guinevere first meet, they realize that they were actually destined to be together. But Lancelot, being pretty much the perfect knight, is way too noble or honorable to do anything about it. He resists this temptation for years and years until, we'll talk about that part later on. But in Lancelot, before Lancelot, most of the stories about Arthur were what's called a chanson de guerre, which is a song of war. And then the introduction of Lancelot kind of shows you where this romantic tradition took over with this concept of this ideal person, this perfect knight. So Lancelot became the most brave and trusted of Arthur's knights. Arthur even sent him to go accompany and escort Guinevere and bring her back. In some versions, he sent to rescue Guinevere. You have that story of the damsel in distress scene. But then his love for Guinevere becomes his fatal flaw, because even though he's perfect, he does have this one temptation. And most of the stories have him reconciled with Arthur by the time of his death. So Lancelot makes this one mistake, but then he spends the rest of his life atoning for it, and the two men make peace before they die. If you're a fan of Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, you'll recognize this prototype with Merlin. And Merlin's kind of the original version of this. This is this wizard mentor, a prophet of some kind. In the Celtic, he was actually a magician and possibly even a shape changer. And he's the one that acts as a mentor or an advisor to Arthur. And in some of the stories, there's a side plot with Merlin where he falls in love or becomes seduced by this beautiful enchantress on the guise of teaching her all of his secrets. And what she does is tricks him, steals all of his magic and secrets, and then imprisons him for many, many years. The Lady of the Lake is this mythical character that shows up, again, mostly in the romances. Was supposed to be from this mythical island of Avalon, and she's the one that brings the sword, Excalibur, to Arthur, and then leads the ladies who carry off the king in the final battle. and Guinevere. Guinevere is the beautiful princess who gets married to Arthur, and they have a perfectly lovely marriage. You know, everything's great. She really admires her husband, and she's very faithful to him, but again, has this kind of love at first sight moment with Lancelot. And eventually, she also, along with Lancelot, gives into this temptation and betrays her husband. And then Lancelot and Guinevere's betrayal kind of marks the downfall of Camelot, because from this moment on, right within the heart of the kingdom, you have this betrayal, and the rest of the ideal nature of the kingdom isn't able to stick together after that. So again, in many versions, she's originally met by Lancelot to be escorted to her wedding, or sometimes she's saved or rescued from a situation by Lancelot. And then again, it's Arthur's discovery of his wife and his best friend's infidelity that kind of breaks this whole dream and idealized version of Camelot in the Round Table. The legend is that Guinevere, after she betrayed her husband, joins a convent where she lives out the rest of her life in prayer and trying to make atonement for this. And she's often credited with keeping Excalibur safe, that she hides Excalibur and keeps Excalibur until the last battle. And again, like Lancelot, she and Arthur make peace with each other before they both die. Now, Mordred plays different roles in these different stories, but he's always some sort of a nemesis or enemy for Arthur. In some of the versions, he tries to capture and steal the Queen Guinevere. In others, he's actually Arthur's illegitimate son. There's this whole little side plot about Arthur and this other woman and having this baby out of wedlock. But in most of the versions, again, Arthur and Mordred actually fatally wound each other in the final battle. Arthur has to take out Mordred, and Mordred's trying to destroy the kingdom. So whether or not it's just a random enemy, or it's Arthur's nephew or Arthur's son, it's always this person that's opposing King Arthur in all of the legends. Now, almost all of the legends, the Celtic, the Roman, the French, the romances, all mention this sword of Arthur, Excalibur. Sometimes it's referred to as Caliburn, which is more of the Celtic name. And the legend goes that it was forged again at this magical island of Avalon. We have the sword and the stone mythology that comes out, that the sword was placed there until the rightful king could come of age. The later legend says that Excalibur was actually given to Arthur by the Lady of the Lake. So there's these two different versions of how Arthur came about this sword. But we know that at Arthur's death, the king had the sword thrown into the lake to give back to the ladies there, or either Gerfled or Bedivere, depending on which version of the story you have. One of his knights is told to take the sword and throw it back into the lake, giving it back to the magical lady of the lake, and presumably, again, waiting for either the next deserving king or for Arthur's return. So Monty Python fans have been waiting for this one. There are several legends and elements that show up about things that Arthur did while he was king. One of them is the story of the Holy Grail, which is a classic quest story. So there's this call, there's this thing that they go out to do, there's temptations along the way, and this thing that they bring back. Now, the Holy Grail was said to be this cup from the Last Supper of Jesus. So as Jesus sat and drank and ate and drank with his disciples, that this is the cup that he would have drank out of and passed around to everyone. And the quest to go find this Holy Grail is full of lots of side stories about Arthur's knights, about the tests and trials that they went through. And Lancelot would have been the logical choice to go and find the knight, because it was said that only a knight that was pure in heart could go and get this. But we know that Lancelot messed up by fooling around with Arthur's wife, so he wasn't eligible anymore. And most of the legends have a young knight named Galahad, who was the only one that was pure enough to actually go and get and retrieve the cup. Particularly in the later legends, we see this idea of the round table show up. This became a symbol of chivalry because no person could be seated above another. Remember, the medieval times would have had these long tables with a place of honor at the top, and then in order of importance, the people who were most important to the king or queen would be seated right next to them, and then all the way down to the end of the table would be the least important people. Arthur said, we're not going to do that. We're going to work on equality. We're going to work on this idea of honoring each other and honoring all people. So we're going to have this round table, and that's, again, this ideal symbolism of chivalry, so that no knight could be seen to be better than another one. During most of the legends, Arthur establishes the seat of his kingdom in Camelot. And this is either a castle or a city that's built up, and this is where Arthur and the Round Table and the knights all get together. And today it's become, we use it sort of interchangeably to mean a place of peace and honor, this idealized vision. When John F. Kennedy was first elected and he came into the White House, and we had this time in the 60s with this idealized vision with this beautiful young wife that he had and this young son, and that he said he was going to restore all these wonderful things to America. A lot of times his early days in office were referred to as Camelot, which is also supposed to be one of his favorite musicals, and he'd go around the White House singing the song from the Broadway version of the show about King Arthur. And so today we call a Camelot anything that is this, again, place that has this vision of peace and honor. Many of the legends have another female character, sometimes known as Morgan Le Fay or Morgause, also referred to as Morgana. And in some of these versions, she's Arthur's half-sister. Sometimes she's a rival queen who's challenging Arthur's kingdom. And sometimes she's the sorceress that gets involved with Merlin that seduces him and locks him up forever, or for this long period of time. Sometimes she's Mordred's mother, and she enchants, in some of the versions, she turns herself into Guinevere and makes Arthur think that he's sleeping with his wife, but it's really this other woman, and so she gets pregnant by tricking Arthur and then gives birth to Mordred, who becomes Arthur's rival. So this character shows up in a lot of the legends, but plays out in different ways and has slightly different names, depending on which version that you're seeing. So why study the Arthurian legends today? Well, in addition to being these classic quest stories, there are so many ways that this has influenced our culture. And just to name a few, and I'm sure you can think of more, the way that this legend or these motifs have shown up, we have the quest for the Holy Grail, we have Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the story of Tristan and Isolde, Sir Galahad, Lord of the Rings with Gandalf is very much a Merlin character. If you're a Star Wars fan, Obi-Wan is very much a Merlin character. Indiana Jones refers to the Holy Grail, the Pendragon or Gargoyle series, and tons of science fiction and fantasy. And then we've seen movies made about this over and over again. Camelot itself, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, Excalibur, First Knight, A Kid in King Arthur's Court, the movie itself, King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table, Merlin, Mists of Avalon was this long series, Monty Python, The Holy Grail, Quest for Camelot, The Sword in the Stone, which is the Disney version, and even more. There's so many times that this has shown up or been a part of some sort of popular culture.